What happens when a country music superstar sits down for what should be a simple morning interview and instead walks into a verbal ambush that spirals completely out of control? It only took one comment from Sunny Hostin to turn a friendly chat into the most explosive moment in daytime television history. Blake Shelton arrived at the View studio that morning expecting to talk about his new album, his tour dates, and maybe share a few laughs with the panel. He walked in with his trademark smile, waving to the audience as they cheered. He settled into the guest chair, adjusted his microphone, and waited for the conversation to begin. Whoopi Goldberg started things off smoothly, asking Blake about his latest single and how the recording process went. Blake leaned forward, clearly excited to share the story behind the music. He talked about spending long nights in the studio, working with talented songwriters, and finding inspiration in everyday moments. The audience seemed genuinely interested. Nodding along as he spoke, Joy Behar jumped in next, asking about his upcoming tour and whether he was excited to get back on the road. Blake grinned and said he couldn't wait to see his fans again. He mentioned how much he missed the energy of live performances and how nothing compared to hearing thousands of people singing along to songs he wrote. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The conversation flowed naturally. There was laughter. There was applause. Nobody could have predicted what was coming next. Then, Sunny Hostin leaned forward in her chair. Her expression shifted. The warmth that had filled the studio suddenly felt a little colder. She looked directly at Blake and said, "Blake, I have to ask you something that's been on my mind. You come from Oklahoma. You represent a certain part of America that many people find, let's just say, problematic. How do you respond to people who say your music and your fan base represent everything that's wrong with this country?" The studio went silent. You could hear the audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Blake's smile faded. He blinked a few times, clearly trying to process what he just heard. He looked around at the other hosts, perhaps hoping someone would step in or clarify the question. Nobody did. They all just stared, waiting for his response. Blake cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me." Sunny didn't hesitate. She repeated herself, speaking even more clearly this time. "Your fan base, Blake, the people who listen to your music, they tend to come from rural areas, conservative backgrounds. These are the same people who have been accused of holding on to outdated values. Do you ever feel responsible for that?" Blake sat back in his chair, his jaw tightened. He took a deep breath before responding. "Sunny, with all due respect, I think you're making some pretty big assumptions about millions of people you've never met. My fans are teachers, nurses, construction workers, parents just trying to raise their kids. They're good people who work hard and care about their families. I don't think that's problematic at all." Whoopi tried to step in. She raised her hand slightly and said, "Okay, let's maybe move on to something else." But Sunny wasn't finished. She cut Whoopi off and continued, "But Blake, you can't deny that country music has a history of exclusion. It's been criticized for not being inclusive, for not representing diverse voices. Don't you think you have a responsibility to address that?" Blake's face reddened. His voice remained calm, but you could hear the frustration building beneath the surface. "I've always supported talented artists, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. Music is music. Talent is talent. I don't think it's fair to paint an entire genre with such a broad brush." Sarah Haynes, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up. "I think what Sunny might be trying to say is that there's been a conversation in the industry about representation. Maybe she's just asking for your perspective on that." Blake nodded toward Sarah, appreciating the attempt to soften the conversation. "I understand that, and it's a conversation worth having, but coming at me like my fans are somehow bad people because of where they live or what they believe, that's not a conversation. That's an attack." Sunny leaned back and crossed her arms. "I'm not attacking anyone, Blake. I'm asking legitimate questions that many people want answers to. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The audience gasped. Several people murmured to each other. Even the other hosts looked shocked by Sunny's tone. Whoopi put her hand on Sunny's arm as if to signal her to pull back, but Sunny shook it off. Blake stood up slightly in his chair, then sat back down. He was clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Sunny, I came here to talk about my music. I didn't come here to be lectured about how terrible you think my fans are. These are real people with real lives, and they deserve respect just like anybody else." Sunny fired back immediately. "And what about the people your fans have disrespected? What about the communities that have been marginalized by the very culture you profit from?" Blake's eyes widened. What are you talking about? What culture am I profiting from? I'm a musician. I write songs. I perform. I don't marginalize anybody, Joy Behar tried to interject. Maybe we should take a breath here and just calm down for a second. But the train had already left the station. There was no stopping it now. Sunny ignored Joy completely and kept going. Blake, you represent an industry that has historically excluded people of color, that has promoted a very narrow view of American life. You can't just sit there and pretend that's not true. Blake stood up. From his chair this time. He didn't yell, but his voice was firm and clear. You know what, Sunny? I've been nothing but respectful since I walked in here. I've answered your questions. I've tried to have a reasonable conversation. But you're not interested in a conversation. You just want to make me into some kind of villain because of where I'm from and what kind of music I make. And I'm not going to sit here and let you insult my fans or my integrity. Sunny stood up as well. Nobody's insulting you, Blake. But if you can't handle being challenged on your privilege and your platform, then maybe you need to examine why that bothers you so much. The word privilege hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Blake laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they can't believe what they're hearing. My privilege? You want to talk about privilege? You're sitting on national television making sweeping judgments about people you've never met, and I'm the one with privilege? That's rich. Whoopi stood up and raised her voice. Okay, everybody just stop for a second. This has gotten way out of hand. Blake, please sit down. Sunny, let's take this down a notch. Blake looked at Whoopi, then back at Sunny. He shook his head slowly. No, I don't think I will sit down. I think I'm done here. Sunny scoffed. Of course you're done. Run away when things get uncomfortable. That's exactly what I expected. That was the final straw. Blake pulled off his microphone and set it on the chair. I'm not running away from anything, Sunny. I'm walking away from someone who has no interest in treating me with basic human decency. There's a difference. Sarah Haynes looked genuinely upset. Blake, please don't leave. Let's just reset and start over. Blake looked at Sarah with what seemed like genuine appreciation for her attempt to salvage the situation. Sarah, I appreciate that, but I can't stay somewhere where I'm being attacked for things I didn't do and beliefs I don't hold. I came here in good faith, and this is what I get. Joy Behar spoke up again. Blake, we've had you on before, and it was great. This doesn't have to end like this. But Blake was already walking toward the edge of the stage. He turned back one more time and looked directly at Sunny. You know what the saddest part about this is? You had a chance to have a real conversation. You could have asked me real questions about music, about creativity, about anything meaningful. Instead, you chose to be hostile and condescending. That says a lot more about you than it does about me. Sunny crossed her arms tighter. I asked you real questions, Blake. You just didn't like them. There's a difference between being hostile and being honest. Blake shook his head again. No, Sunny. Being honest means having a dialogue. What you did was make accusations disguised as questions. You decided who I was before I even sat down. Nothing I said was going to change your mind. Whoopi stepped between them, physically positioning herself as a barrier. All right, that's enough. Blake, if you need to go, you need to go. Sunny, sit down. Everyone just take a breath. The audience didn't know how to react. Some people were silent, mouths hanging open. Others whispered frantically to the person next to them. A few people actually started clapping for Blake, which only made Sunny angrier. Sunny pointed at the audience members who were clapping. Really? You're applauding him for storming off? That's exactly the problem right there. Blake turned back one final time. They're not applauding me for storming off. They're applauding because they recognize when someone is being treated unfairly. Maybe you should think about that. And with that, Blake Shelton walked off the view stage. Cameras caught him disappearing behind the curtain, his shoulders squared and his head held high. The remaining hosts sat in, stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Whoopi was the first to speak. She looked directly into the camera and said, well, that escalated quickly. We're going to take a commercial break and we'll be right back. But before they could cut away, Sunny had to get one more word in. If he can't handle tough questions, he shouldn't be in the public eye. Joy Behar turned to her. Sunny, come on. That wasn't tough questions. That was something else entirely. Sunny threw her hands up. I'm not going to apologize for holding someone accountable. Sarah Haynes shook her head. Accountable for what, exactly? He came here to talk about his album, and you made it about politics and culture wars. That wasn't journalism. That was an ambush. The tension between the hosts was now almost as thick as the tension that had just played out between Sunny and Blake. Whoopi looked exhausted. She rubbed her temples and said, "We'll talk about this." During the break, "Can we please just cut to commercial now?" The cameras finally panned away, but the damage was done. What should have been a lighthearted morning talk show segment had turned into a full-scale confrontation that nobody saw coming. Blake Shelton, one of the biggest names in country music, had walked off one of the most popular daytime television shows on the air. And it all started with one loaded question from Sunny Hostin. As Blake made his way through the backstage area, crew members watched him pass. Some looked sympathetic, others looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to say or do. One production assistant approached him and asked if he was okay. Blake nodded and said, "I'm fine. I just shouldn't have come here today." The production assistant looked genuinely apologetic. "For what it's worth, I thought you handled that really well. A lot of people would have lost their cool completely." Blake managed a small smile. "I appreciate that, but I think it's pretty clear I'm not welcome here." Back on the stage, the commercial break couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the cameras were off, the hosts erupted into their own heated discussion. Joy turned to Sunny and said, "What were you thinking? That was completely out of line." Sunny defended herself. "I was asking questions that needed to be asked. He's a public figure with a massive platform." Sarah Haynes jumped in. "There's a way to ask challenging questions without being confrontational. You weren't trying to get answers. You were trying to make a point." Whoopi held up her hands. "Everyone stop. We can't do this right now. We have a show to finish." Sunny wasn't backing down. "So we're just supposed to give celebrities a pass? We're supposed to let them come on here and not challenge them on anything?" Joy shot back. "There's challenging and then there's attacking. You attack that man for no reason other than he makes country music and comes from Oklahoma." The argument continued until a producer stepped in and told them they had 30 seconds until they were back on air. The hosts quickly composed themselves, fixed their hair, and put on their television smiles. But the damage to their own relationships had been done as well. When they came back from commercial, Whoopi addressed the audience with a carefully worded statement. "As you just saw, things got heated. We have passionate conversations on this show, and sometimes those conversations don't go the way we planned. We respect Blake Shelton and wish him well." It was a diplomatic way of trying to smooth things over, but everyone watching knew what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a passionate conversation. This was one host deciding to put a guest on trial for crimes he didn't commit, and that guest deciding he wasn't going to sit there and take it. Sunny remained silent during Whoopi's statement. Her arms still crossed, her expression unchanged. She didn't look apologetic. She didn't look remorseful. If anything, she looked vindicated, as if Blake leaving only proved her point. The rest of the show limped along awkwardly. The host moved on to other topics, but the energy had completely shifted. The audience seemed distracted, the other panel members seemed tense, and Sunny seemed completely unbothered by the chaos she had created. During another commercial break, Sarah leaned over to Sunny and said quietly, "You owe him an apology." Sunny turned to her sharply. "I don't owe him anything. He chose to leave. That was his decision." Sarah looked stunned. "His decision? You backed him into a corner and then acted surprised when he walked away." Before Sunny could respond, they were back on air again. The show continued, but the shadow of what happened with Blake Shelton hung over every remaining segment. It was all anyone could think about. It was all anyone would talk about. In the green room, staff members were already buzzing about what had just transpired. Some were worried about the fallout. Others were excited about the viral moment they knew was coming. A few were genuinely concerned about Blake and whether he was okay. One makeup artist who had worked with Blake before the show said to a colleague, "He was so nice when he came in. We were laughing and joking around. I can't believe it ended like that." Her colleague nodded. "I was watching from the monitor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing." She just kept going at him. Meanwhile, Blake had already left the building. He walked out to where his car was waiting and got in without saying a word to anyone else. His manager, who had been watching from backstage, rushed out after him. "Blake, wait!" his manager called out. Blake stopped and turned around. "I'm not doing a statement. I'm not addressing this. I just want to go home." His manager nodded. "I understand. But you know this is going to be everywhere in about 10 minutes." Blake sighed deeply. Let it be everywhere. I'm not the one who should be embarrassed about what happened in there. And he was right. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were already being shared across social media. People were taking sides. Some defended Sunny, saying she was just doing her job as a journalist. But far more people defended Blake, saying he was ambushed and treated unfairly. Back inside the studio, as the show wrapped up, Whoopi pulled Sunny aside. "We need to talk about what happened today." Sunny crossed her arms again, her default defensive posture. "What about it?" Whoopi looked tired. "You can't do that to guests, Sunny. You can't bring someone on and attack them like that." Sunny's voice rose. "I didn't attack him. I asked him tough questions about important issues." Whoopi shook her head. "No, you made assumptions about him and his fans and then demanded he defend himself against those assumptions. That's not journalism. That's not even good. Television. That's just mean." Sunny looked genuinely shocked that Whoopi was confronting her. "So you're taking his side?" Whoopi put her hand on Sunny's shoulder. "I'm not taking anyone's side. I'm telling you that what happened today crossed a line, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences of that." Those consequences were already beginning to unfold. Social media was exploding with reactions. Blake's fans were furious, calling for Sunny to be held accountable. Media outlets were already writing articles about the confrontation, and everyone had an opinion about who was right and who was wrong. The thing is, most people didn't see this as a complicated situation with nuance on both sides. They saw a successful musician who came on a talk show to promote his work and instead got lectured and insulted by a host who seemed more interested in making a political statement than having a real conversation. They saw someone who tried to remain respectful and calm in the face of repeated provocations. And they saw someone who finally decided he'd had enough and walked away with his dignity intact. Sunny, for her part, seemed completely unaware of how badly she had misread the situation. In her mind, she had done exactly what she was supposed to do. She had challenged someone with a platform. She had asked difficult questions. She had refused to let him off easy. But what she failed to understand was that there's a difference between challenging someone and attacking them. There's a difference between asking tough questions and making accusations. There's a difference between holding someone accountable and holding them responsible for things they never did or said. Blake Shelton didn't walk off that stage because he couldn't handle tough questions. He walked off that stage because he recognized that nothing he said was going to matter. Sunny had already made up her mind about who he was and what he represented, and no amount of reasonable responses or thoughtful explanations was going to change that. In the end, what happened on The View that day wasn't really about Blake Shelton, or country music, or rural America, or any of the topics Sunny claimed to be concerned about. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Blake came to that studio expecting to be treated with basic professional courtesy. He expected to answer questions about his work, share some stories, and connect with viewers. Instead, he was treated like he was on trial for representing a part of America that one host found distasteful. And when he refused to accept that treatment, when he stood up and walked away, he sent a clear message. You don't get to disrespect people just because you disagree with where they come from or what they do. You don't get to make sweeping generalizations about millions of people and expect the person you're talking to just sit there and take it. The View continued on after Blake left, but something had fundamentally changed. The show had always been known for heated debates and strong opinions, but there was usually an understanding that guests were there to be engaged with, not attacked. What Sunny did crossed that line, and everyone in that studio knew it. As the credits rolled on that day's episode, the hosts said their goodbyes to the audience. But the tension between them was obvious. Joy barely looked at Sunny, Sarah seemed upset, and Whoopi looked like she was ready to be done with the whole day. The audience filed out of the studio, still buzzing about what they had witnessed. Many of them immediately pulled out their phones to text friends or post about what they had seen. They knew they had been present for a moment that would be talked about for a long time, and they were right. The Blake Shelton walkout became one of the most talked about moments in The View's history. It sparked debates about media bias, about how celebrities should be treated on talk shows, and about the responsibilities of hosts when interviewing guests. But beneath all of that, the real story was much simpler. It was about a man who came to work, tried to do his job, and was met with hostility instead of hospitality. It was about someone who gave respect and expected it in return, and when he didn't get it, he made the decision to leave. Blake Shelton walked off The View that day not because he was weak or couldn't handle criticism. He walked off because he was strong enough to know his worth and confident enough to remove himself from a situation where he was being disrespected. And in doing so, he showed millions of people watching at home that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away.